Welcome to today's session, our CPD session. And today's session is on motivation, and more specifically on intrinsic motivation. And it's a topic of growing interest, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it's a very warm welcome again from me and from Professor John Perry. So this is the first of the CPD sessions that we're running with Professor John Perry. So congratulations to John on his appointment. Okay, so this is part of a CPD series. Well, as we've mentioned in the other sessions, we now know so much more about mental toughness and its applications than we did 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago when we started. And we are learning all the time. We're building that body of knowledge as practitioners go out there, take our concepts into different applications and different areas of interest, and they come back with their observations. And we also, obviously collaborate with people like John to go and hand over data and say, what's in that data, John? And there are some really interesting things come out of that. And we'll finish today's session with one of those insights. But ultimately, we need to be able to turn all of that knowledge and information round so that we put it back into the hands of practitioners. And so the whole focus of the program is to equip practitioners with the knowledge to be able to do an even better job in the future. So at the end of the session, we'd really appreciate you can perhaps take the mics off. A very brief conversation about what do we think we can do to engage more practitioners? Because we are getting a degree of engagement. It's diminishing a little bit, but how do we get people back to listen and grow? Anyway, so we have set out a list of 18 topics that we think would be of interest to practitioners, but of course we need to listen to practitioners and find out what it is that they're interested in. So we've already covered understanding the factors, and that's about the things we're discovering about nuance, about the way they connect with each other, about the significance of dimensionality. We covered leadership and how mental toughness had a part to play in understanding leadership. And today's discussion is perhaps another aspect of that. And then we looked at team working. So we do want to know what you and others, what you think others might want to know. We would like to engage people more in this program. Now, I'm not going to go through this because I can see, well, I think nearly everybody has been through our program or has an understanding of it. But basically, for anybody who doesn't, the mental toughness concept consists of 8 factors. So there are 8 components to our mental toughness, and they all have some significance to some extent every time we do something. And those factors are life control, our sense of self-worth, emotional control, our ability to manage our emotional responses, goal orientation, our sense of purpose and the extent to which we set goals, achievement orientation, the extent to which we are minded to make an effort to achieve what we want, risk orientation, the extent to which we see the future and the world around us as full of opportunity and not as threats, learning orientation, the extent to which we reflect on and learn that from everything we do, confidence and abilities, the extent to which we recognize that we have abilities and believe that we can deal with whatever life or work throws at us. And finally, interpersonal confidence, our ability to engage effectively for a whole variety of reasons with the people around us. Okay. Very quick run through the mental toughness concept. One of the things, I suppose, if we were to talk about the kind of things that clients ask AQR to attend to, it's very often in this area of stress, pressure, and challenge. And listening to the clients, the kind of things that they talk about predominantly are the main sources are beginning to work to tight deadlines, and very often increasingly tight deadlines. It seems that clients become increasingly demanding, so providers of services and products and resources have to respond to that. And just think about Amazon and next day delivery. I think 5 years ago, we wouldn't have expected next day delivery from anybody. And then there's the issue of resources. Resources seem to be getting tighter, partly because people are expensive to hire and therefore we try to get by with less. Then there's hitting performance targets and particularly complying with systems. Organizations are more systems orientated increasingly, and that's I think a fallout from ISO 9000 and so on. But there's a question to ask about the way that we follow systems. If we are so driven by systems, what does that do for our autonomy? And perhaps John will pick that up a little later. And then clients, the funny thing is I'm talking about us. We are constantly making more and more demand on the people that give us services or whatever. And it's a tougher gig to try and satisfy their needs. And then there's a whole pile of other factors. Now, there's the personal external factors, there's the state of the economy, the social, and even things like COVID. These all have presented challenges. And a war far away from here, the Gaza war and the consequences for the Houthi rebels now threatens to impact upon our economic well-being. So there are lots and lots of things that create stress, pressure, and challenge. Now we know that mental toughness is a factor that helps people to respond positively to all of these, or at least to be able to cope and not to deal with them. In the work context, you will very often find it's been almost a traditional response for employers to respond by applying extrinsic motivation. I know you're under pressure, here's a bit more money. I'm going to give you this to do, and if you do well, you'll earn this bonus. So those can often be effective in a very short term, but they don't seem to be a solution which works in the longer term. And that's going to be the focus of the rest of our discussion today. So if we were to summarize what do organizations seek, we tend to see four things emerging consistently. Increasingly, employers are interested in the well-being of their staff. They want contented staff who actually find satisfaction and a degree of enjoyment in the work they do. It's much easier to work with people if they are happy in this sort of way. Organizations, of course, also want performance. They want something to happen efficiently and effectively, and whatever it is that they do has got to be delivered in that manner. And then an increasing and sort of the old chestnut is coming back. That's about building team working, except now team working is focused not so much on my team. My team isn't functioning terribly well, but it's much more of a cultural thing. It's about building a team right across the organization, getting everybody to collaborate to sort of eliminate those inefficiencies that competing teams within an organization can create, and getting the whole organization, the whole team, committed to achieving the organization's purpose. And then finally, I would say in the last 18 months, every single client that we work with has mentioned this: better retention. We're beginning to see issues about keeping staff. People will often not commit to a full-time job. People will often stay in a job for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and move on. And what we're seeing is turnover is increasing. And of course, turnover is one of those things that sometimes works for an employer, but very often imposes costs on an employer, because if you lose a member of staff, you have to cost money to recruit, to replace them. And of course, it costs money to get them up to speed to be able to do what the departing employee would have done. So what we find is that organizations tend to focus a lot in those areas. And that retention one perhaps has been impacted by COVID as well. We've seen a change in work patterns for a lot of people, not all people, but for a lot of people. And so this has created a series of problems. They're interrelated problems. So what might be the solution? So we would argue, of course, that one of those enablers, probably the most important one, or one of the most important, is to develop resilience and positivity. Help your people to understand how to thrive, not just to survive. And then allied to that is think about what you do. Think about the world that you're creating for your employees. So one thing you can do, obviously, is help your employees to deal with stresses and pressure, but you can also do something to try and minimize and eliminate those stressors and pressure. And then we're beginning to see leadership kind of bouncing back up the agenda again. And we're beginning to see leadership coming into the picture in a slightly different way than before. We're beginning to move away from the old scientific management roots. We're beginning to see leadership practice emerging, which focuses on care, compassion, understanding, and supporting people. And then our subject of today's discussion is creating a degree of intrinsic motivation in staff. It's something that we've known about for a long time. And I would sort of liken it to something that everybody has known something about, but nobody until recently, or very few people until recently, have taken it seriously. It's always been easy to introduce extrinsic motivation. Let's solve a problem by throwing money at it. Intrinsic motivation has the capability to be much more effective. And won't surprise you, there is a mental toughness connection. So I'm going to hand over to John. So John is going to pick up here and talk about this. So I'm going to stop sharing, John, and you can share your slides.
All right, yeah, we can do it that way. That's fine. Let me look between here.
So you can all now see the cell that John's in, and with good behaviour, you should be able to get out in short order.
University of Limerick tend to sort of have this as a bit of the interior design team, I think, seem to just like, that's wrong. Yeah, they don't like plasterboard, I don't think. Where do I get this? I always have this issue, you know, when you're on Zoom.
All right, but I can see it.
Comes up. Oh, hang on. Is that the one that's got the next slide bit, or is it just got the actual?
It's self-determination theory.
Perfect. That'll do. So, yeah, I was surprised, to be honest, to hear that intrinsic motivation, self-determination was not widely spoken about in business settings, because actually, having a background working in sport and then a fair bit in education as well, where the motivation generally is fairly intrinsic, because you don't get as much external benefit from a lot of sport and education. I kind of assumed that's what things were like, but actually in the business world, yeah, motivation typically, especially some of the older leadership theories, has been quite controlled. So self-determination theory explores the extent to which people perceive that their behaviors are governed by themselves, okay? So determined by themselves. It's called a meta theory. There's 6 sub-theories. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll touch on a couple. One of the sub-theories is the basic psychological needs, which suggests that there are 3 basic psychological needs, which we'll come to, of course, competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And another one called organismic integration theory, which is not a very catchy one, essentially identifies motivation on a continuum of controlled motivation through to autonomous motivation, which you can kind of understand as extrinsic into intrinsic motivation. So, for example, if we look at the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see the black box that says A motivation, because the English language seems to have this little knack of you put an A in front of a word and it becomes the opposite of something. So an absence of motivation, when you don't really see any contingency between effort and reward. So what's the point? We then have extrinsic motivation in the middle, but think about it as a continuum of gradually becoming more internalized. So external regulation is when you do something through compliance. You do it because you think, I must do this. Introjected regulation is when you do something to avoid some sort of internal punishment. So to stave off feelings of guilt, for example. So I do it because I feel I should. Identified regulation is when we want to, and there's an importance to it, but it's still a means to an end, which is what makes it extrinsic motivation. And integrated regulation is when it feels completely internal, because there's a congruence with that sense of wanting to do something, but we still require an external force to actually summon up the motivation to do it. So as we go through those, we're gradually internalizing behavior from I must do something, I don't want to do something, I must do something, I should do something, I want to do it, but I want the reward that comes with it, through to finally the most self-determined type of motivation, intrinsic motivation, which is when we do something as an end in itself. So often this is because of feelings of accomplishment, just experiencing stimulation. It feels good to do it. Why would you do a bungee jump? You know, just for the thrill. Or feelings of accomplishment. Unsurprisingly, a huge plethora of research finds that intrinsic motivation is linked to more consistent effort, greater persistence, increased confidence. And what we'd see when we conduct our analyses with mental toughness is significant positive associations between intrinsic motivation and certainly some of the aspects of mental toughness as well. The basic psychological needs theory was developed as a sub-theory, of self-determination by Deci and Ryan in the mid-80s, and identified three basic needs that we require for well-being, which was competence or mastery, feeling like you're good at things, autonomy, which is having that freedom to do the things I want to do. Like I have a sense of control. I know people in organizational development talk of sort of job crafting quite often now, sort of skill with that, having that capacity to be able to dictate to a larger or lesser extent how much control I have over the actions. And relatedness, which is how well we engage with the social world around us, a feeling of belonging, feeling that you support others and are supported by them. And there's tons of research around those. And we've frequently seen recently from practitioners, and Doug will comment to this later, the benefit from also considering purpose. So knowing that you're doing something that has some meaning to it, preferably some kind of internalized meaning. So just to touch on those a little bit more in terms of relatedness, feeling that sense of attachment to other people. And with all of these, while they're basic human needs, so everybody at some level needs to be able to satisfy these needs, everybody has a kind of different, there's individual differences in how important that need is to an individual. So for some people, relatedness, particularly if you're quite extroverted, you need people around you to be able to feed off that kind of energy. autonomy wise, for example, some people are quite happy with less autonomy. Some people really don't like not having much autonomy. So there's individual differences among them. And it involves feelings of closeness, a sense of belonging to a group. And what's always strikes me is whenever we talk about any psychological concept to a group, people always talk about, but the group I belong to, as if there's going to be some huge cultural difference, whether it's between either a nation or a religion or a gender or even a province or a town or a city within a geographical area. And the answer is almost always there's minimal differences. People are much more alike than they are different, really. But the fact that people are always kind of striving to feel that the group they belong to is unique in some kind of way really underscores how important to people that feeling of belonging to a social group is. And you look at things like nationalism, everything like that, which seem completely bananas, really, but there's not a lot of rationale to it unless you understand people's need to feel that like they're part of a bigger group. Feeling that you're supported is obviously particularly vital. Go back to that question around retention. Feeling that you're able to offer support to others, so I'm of use to others. I'm not just passive in receiving this relationship, but I'm part of an active bi-directional relationship with a group. Autonomy then is feeling that sense of control over one's behaviours, destiny, feeling that it's worth me coming up with a good idea because I might be able to explore that idea, and being able to make decisions, having a sense of independence while maintaining that level of support, and feeling that there's some kind of choice. And where it gets threatened is when you think about that continuum towards the left-hand side, where you've got the external motivators, particularly external regulation, this idea of I must. So why are you adopting the behavior you're adopting? Because I don't want to suffer the consequences of not doing that behavior. Presents you with incredibly little autonomy. That's why it's called controlled motivation. And that ties in with another theory called cognitive evaluation theory, where if you offer external rewards, which money is the most prominent external reward, what you actually do is undermine intrinsic motivation. By adding external rewards to intrinsic motivation, you don't have more motivation. You just drag people along that continuum towards the external regulation. By offering more informational rewards, you're encouraging more autonomous motivation. You're encouraging people to internalize. So people want to learn. People have a desire to learn. And one of the reasons retention is dropping in businesses around the world is really people are switched on to the fact that if you spend 2 or 3 years somewhere, you've learned a certain amount from that you'll feel nearer the ceiling of what you're going to be able to learn. You go somewhere new, you'll learn more stuff because it's new. It might not even be better, but it's more appealing because at least you'll keep learning. So one of the challenges for the leaders then is, are we rewarding people in an informational way? Are we encouraging their autonomous motivation? Are we encouraging them towards learning, feeling like they're accomplishing, feeling like they're moving forward, feeling like they're gaining more knowledge? Because that's the stuff that encourages greater autonomy. And mastery, of course, pretty much any psychological concept, particularly motivational ones, there has to be something related to a self-belief concept that underpins it. Feeling that I have the sufficient skills, knowledge, and experience in order to perform something. So you can think about how those things relate to one another. If I don't feel that I'm sufficiently skilled or capable for something, then too much autonomy is quite frightening, which means I sort of fall into this funk of just seeing work as a transactional behavior. I'm basically selling my labor in return for the wage check at the end of the week or month. If I feel like I'm competent at what I do, then I strive for more autonomy. And then when I have more competence or autonomy, I get more of a sense that I'm progressing, and that's individually rewarding, almost as an end in itself. I say almost as an end in itself. I still want to get my pay check at the end of the month, right? And then finally, I mentioned that practitioners are keen to bring a sense of purpose into this. And this is probably what really sets aside intrinsic motivation from that integrated regulation. You know, the point at which motivation crosses from being an external means to an end that I might share values with into it becoming an end in itself. Okay, so if I take Doug, for example, it won't shock many people to know Doug could retire. Doug is of an age where he could retire. So what keeps Doug going? And I suppose that's the test of, have you really moved from that more internalized version of extrinsic motivation into genuine intrinsic motivation? Well, if you take away the extrinsic reward, do you still have a desire to do it? Now, that doesn't mean that you definitely would do it, but you would miss it and you want to do it. And to me, that's probably where purpose is the bit that helps shift it into being genuinely intrinsic. So it describes the extent to which an individual feels that they're doing something worthwhile and valuable. It is soul crushing when you spend time at work having to do administrative tasks that you feel are ticking boxes, you know, where you just think there's no value to this. You know, that some of those training things you might have where it's you watch a bunch of online videos and then you answer a few questions and you think, this is not for me. This is just so my organization can tick a box and blame me because I've been provided with some training. Those kind of tasks that you have that think, this is completely, I'm just wasting my time here. They pull people away from the autonomous end of that continuum in the same way that purely financial rewards would do, and the more egotistical stuff. Whereas having a genuine sense that you're making a worthwhile difference to someone or some people or the world pulls you more towards that intrinsic end of things. So how does this relate to mental toughness? I took away the diagram that had there, Doug, so just it makes more this bit made more sense to me. But if we think about our 8 factors that we have in our 4 C's model of mental toughness around the confidence, control, challenge and commitment areas there, relatedness, of course, interpersonal confidence is strongly related to that, and also emotional control, which is being able to experience more of those positive emotions that you will do if you have the right amount of relatedness that suits your personality. Autonomy, clearly life control and autonomy would be very closely linked because it's the extent to which you see yourself as, I suppose, the main character in that sense, but also risk orientation, feeling that the greater sense I have that I'm able to execute the required actions to bring about the thing I want to bring about, the more likely I am to suggest something and take those risks. If I feel that I want something to happen, I'm happy to be accountable for it, but I don't have the responsibility to do so, then I'm more likely to be risk averse. Or I would say, I suppose, put it the other way, because mental toughness has a significant kind of genetic component, I might remain highly risk oriented, but I'm going to be frustrated by lack of autonomy. High levels of interpersonal confidence means I probably get a lot of energy from being surrounded by people. So if I don't have that kind of relatedness, particularly through, think about like remote working, I'm going to be frustrated. And you see mastery clearly linked to those components there, and purpose strongly related to a sense of commitment. So I'll go back to you now, Doug, if I hit stop share, and I'll let you take it on.
Right. So here we go. Right. So thank you, John. And I think that's a really, really good, very accessible description of intrinsic motivation, or whether you consider it the 3 or 4 factors. And when we find that when we introduce that to clients, they're actually very often quite amazed that they can understand it pretty quickly, and they can understand how it might work. And I think one of the questions that I think Leah asked during the conversation is relevant here. He makes a point that people very rarely talk about intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, or different types of motivation. They just talk about motivation as if it's one thing. And I think perhaps part of our job, it's a bit like the work we do with mental toughness, is also to educate people that motivation isn't one thing. There are different dimensions to motivation, and some of them can be more effective than others. And that takes me to leadership, because I said earlier that there was a link between leadership and motivation, and of course there is. I don't have to explain that to anyone. And leadership is essentially about achieving an optimum performance or an optimum outcome through engaging with people in such a way that they give their discretionary effort, so they make the very best effort that they can. Well, that has to mean motivation. And if you look at all the good leadership models that are out there, and the integrated leadership model and measure that we've developed is, in effect, it's not a new model, it's simply a statement of a summary of the best models that are out there. And that points to 3 things: that there are 3 aspects of leadership that really matter, 3 sets of behaviors. One is around determination to deliver and having purpose. And you see that feature in all sorts of models. That obviously relates to purpose that we've just discussed. So if a leader has purpose and has a determination to deliver, and it's a worthwhile purpose, they're likely to have an impact on the follower. If they don't, where does the follower's purpose come from? And then if you look at engagement with the individual, well, as John said, the second component is a leader has to engage with the individual, and it has to be at an individual level. And that sometimes challenges leaders, because they think, well, I have 3,000 people in this organization, how do I do that? And that's the whole point of an organization structure, and making sure that there's a culture in place that the way you would deal with people is the way that everybody in the organization deals with people. And what we're talking about here is 2 particular aspects of that. Individuals want autonomy, they want mastery. So the role of a leader is to provide that autonomy, to build that level of trust and courage that enables them to say, this is what we need to achieve. I'm going to leave you to do what you need to do because I know you can do it. That is linking leadership behavior to autonomy and mastery. And then finally, in the integrated leadership model, we do talk about engagement with team working, and we always say that is not about the accounts team or the production team or whatever, the invoicing team. it's about their culture. And if we can create a culture where everybody feels that they belong and that they can support, they get support when they need it, and they can provide support to other people willingly and enthusiastically, that's a better environment in which to work. And it's an environment in which you can confidently make your contribution. So that's linking to relatedness. So we can see in the previous CPD workshop, when we looked closely at leadership, we were able to show that link with mental toughness. Here, we've already seen a link between mental toughness and motivation, or intrinsic motivation. Here, we're kind of completing the loop. Leadership, team working, mental toughness, and motivation, they're all aspects of the same thing that we are all trying to aspire to, and certainly in all walks of life we're trying to aspire to. So in summary, what we can say is that the mental toughness concept and frameworks, I'm coming back to mental toughness, provides that lens through which users can explore, explain and understand what motivation is, and to be able to identify that those different forms of motivation and how an individual's mental toughness profile impacts on intrinsic motivation. And if we can do that, we can perhaps optimize it. And this is the commercial. We have in progress the development of an inventory which is capable of assessing those 4 factors in organizations. It's got about 50 items, and the plan is that it will eventually complement the MTQ+. That'll be available shortly. So now coming back to you, what questions have you got? What do you want to know about mental toughness? So I'm going to throw it open, and I think we can safely ask you to put your mics on and simply ask your question. You don't have to put it through the chat. Well, Anthony has asked the question, John, do low scores, I assume, on mental toughness impact on motivation?
Yeah, I was I started typing an answer to this one, and it was getting very long. So I'll wait. So again, it depends what kind of motivation we're talking about. So in general, most of the mental toughness factors are positively associated with intrinsic motivation.
Right.
As you go towards the more controlled end of motivation, the relationship becomes smaller. Okay. It can become so varied though that it's hard to really point out what that relationship is, because some things, such as achievement orientation within commitment, if you're high in any kind of motivation, that's still pretty positively associated with it. So even if your motivation is high, but it's driven by, you know, you're a private in the army who has no autonomy, and you're told exactly what to do all the time, you're doing it because you've been told to do it, and your job is to follow orders. So it's externally regulated completely. So something like that, achievement orientation would be positively associated with it because you're good at it. But life control would be negatively associated with that, because people with high life control, if you put them in that sort of situation where they have no autonomy, they're just going to get pissed off, right? So I suppose when people are in that situation, in something that's as regimented and as hierarchical, and I suppose, look, a military setting's like an extreme example, but it does give you an idea of working within hierarchies.
Yeah.
Understanding somebody's mental toughness profile, that person who's really high in life control wants autonomy.
Yeah.
So when they're at the start of their journey, they're going to get frustrated, because generally, if you work in an organization with a large hierarchy, you have less autonomy the further down you go. So if you don't recognize that and allow somebody at least give them a sense that there will be progression where you'll get that autonomy, or you
Yes.
try and feed it in some way, you'll lose them, because they'll go work in a flatter organization where you get more of it. So it's like the classic academic sort of response. It's complicated. It depends which bits of mental toughness and which bits of motivation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, John.
I think that's quite an interesting question, Anthony, because at different stages in my career, I've operated as a consultant, and quite often I've been taken into organizations who wonder why they don't get better performance, but they've done things like introduce ISO 9000, and they've misunderstood what ISO 9000 or BS 5750, as it used to be, does. I mean, yes, it's very useful and it's a beneficial thing to systemize everything, write down your systems and ensure that those systems are complied with. But they can have a negative impact. And I think I've lost count of the number of times that you go in and you spot things that are sort of bleeding obviously wrong, and yet people are still doing it because it's the system. And you know, and when you think about this, you say, well, why do people not? But they know that it's wrong. Why aren't they putting their hands up and saying something about it? And I suppose we've seen a super version of that with Mr. Bates in the post office. You know, there you are. You had 953 people being sent to prison or being fined for something that they plainly didn't do. And anybody standing on the sidelines would have said, stop. But nobody inside said stop because it's the system.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can see so the consequences in the big picture. And as John said, when you work in large organizations, the people at the bottom of the organization often don't even know the names of the people at the top of the organization. They just know they've been handed a set of rules.
Yeah.
Doug, on that point, the point around BS 5750 ISO is that does that not then underline the fact of why the purpose and stating the purpose becomes really critical?
It is, but you know, when 5750 and ISO 9000 were introduced, and funnily enough, we have actually got partners who do both introduce mental toughness and do ISO 9000 projects. But the whole purpose of ISO 9000 actually appealed to one particular aspect of mental toughness, and that's learning orientation. Because the belief was that unless you knew what you were doing, when it didn't work, you didn't know what you had to put right. And so the idea of how introducing a system and operating it until it began to fail to deliver what it was supposed to deliver, you should then stop and say, something's wrong, let's look at it, let's improve it. So ISO 9000 was never intended as, here is a set of rules that you're going to work according to which you're going to work for all time. It was originally, if you look at all the original literature, it was all to do with continuous improvement ethos, but nobody ever does that. Or, sorry, some people do, but a lot of people don't.
Yeah, that was really interesting. That was a really interesting one. I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah.
And Lee makes a point that companies struggle to separate people, technology, and processes. And ISO 9001 becomes a tick box exercise. And that's right. But and so many things do. You know, the whole point about trying to develop the mental toughness concept is to try and get people to understand. John is very, very strong on this. The idea of nuance, that it isn't black and white. This is a tool for understanding. This is not a tool for labeling. And if you can get people to the point of understanding things, then you might get them to the point of saying, well, was there a better way? Could I have done this differently? Could I have done it better? Could I have retained staff better? And you know, it doesn't just connect to intrinsic motivation. It connects to almost everything that people do in organizations. But have we any other questions? Any other comments? By all means, if you think this is a load of bollocks, say so, and we'll
No,
discuss
hi,
that.
hi, Doug. It's Karen Sprung,
Hi, Karen.
and as you know, I work around as a consultant, going in to help companies do that talent acquisition piece.
Yeah.
But equally so, especially in the last 18 months, like you said, the focus has been on actually we've got these people now, or we've got a pipeline of people, but we haven't really got a way of onboarding them that is probably timely and is systematically driven. So they're looking for advice and guidance on two things. A, if there are gaps, how can they retain the people that they've got? So they're doing the workforce plan, they're doing the recruitment, you can see a pipeline, but there's this gap where they think, actually, we're still hemorrhaging staff in certain areas. So it might be a contact center, which is quite a transactional role. People go in it to sort of get a little bit of a immediate just some work. I suppose graduates leaving, I'll do it for 6 months and then I'll pay my debts off and I'm gone. So it's certain roles that have a really high turnover. And I'm just wondering how RAMP potentially could help organizations put in a sort of internal mobility program. So before people start to jump, you assess them, and effectively they then might say, oh, well, actually, I came in to do this job, pay my debts off, whatever. But actually, there could be an opportunity over there for me. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in a nutshell, when you're recruiting somebody, you're recruiting a known, largely something that's unknown. The more you know about that individual, the more that you understand the buttons that might work for them. And this is coming back to, there are a minimum of 40,000 different combinations of mental toughness profile. So you can't just look at all the people you're recruiting and saying, these are all of the same type. The more you understand those differences, and as you know, as every practitioner here knows, it's not expensive. The mental toughness questionnaire is not an expensive questionnaire and yields a lot of valuable information. The more you understand about that individual, the better you are able to respond to that individual's needs. Now, not everybody wants to be a rocket scientist. And you've heard the story, President Kennedy walking around Cape Canaveral, and he came across the cleaner and said, what do you do around here? And the cleaner responded, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. So, there you see, that's an example of intrinsic motivation. You might, at one level, dismiss being a cleaner as a pretty low-level job. Actually, he was getting something out of doing his job, and he felt part of something significant. So, kind of, you can work with people at all sorts of levels, but you need to know something about them in the first place. And I've got a little example. We did a project for the Scottish Funding Council, when we looked at, I'll come back to you in a moment, Lee. We looked at graduates from two programs. One was a hospitality program and one was an IT program. And they assessed the mental toughness of the students. And the first question they wanted to ask was, did the more mentally tough students get a job more quickly than the more mentally sensitive? And that's what emerged. And they found that the more mentally tough got better jobs. But the great thing they then did is they went into the organizations and said, right, how quickly did your new recruit get up to speed? And they found the more mentally tough the new employee, the faster they got up to speed. The more mentally sensitive, more slowly they got up to speed. But that wasn't the end of the story, because they then said, can we assess the mental toughness of the people who were doing the onboarding? And they found a correlation there. The more mentally tough the people handling the onboarding, the faster the new employee came on board. The more mentally sensitive, the more slowly they came on board. So, I agree with you, Karen. The way you bring people on board will have long-term consequences, but then the mental toughness concept and understanding intrinsic motivation is what's going to be able to stretch that employment period even more. And as you know, if your labour turnover, people turn over every 2 years, you lose your staff every 2 years. To simply extend that to 3 years saves a fortune. You're not going to keep people forever. You can't trap them,
No.
but you can actually operate in a much better way.
Okay. And what's the timelines on RAM? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I can see the value of it.
Well, we're just going out now trying to get people, organizations to pilot it so that we can accumulate data just to check that the items we've developed are robust.
Yeah. And are you looking
so
at,
if you know of anybody who's
yeah,
interested in piloting or trialing it, we'd
Yeah.
love to hear from you.
is there a,
Yeah,
just
Doug,
last
Sorry?
question, is there a minimum number?
Well, because it's effectively an employee survey in reality, you really want decent numbers, you know, at least 30 or 40 people.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Now, Lee, you had your hand raised. Your question?
Well, it's just really a comment around the challenges of using tools to manage talent when most organizations are actually motivated to hire resource. So working in contact centers and sales teams where there is a high turnover. Challenge you've got is that you want to extend the lifetime value of the employee, but it's that return on investment and also the capability of the managers to be able to use tools like this. That's the challenge, is that you don't have the competence in the management infrastructure to be able to apply these tools. That's the real challenge. But there are organizations out there that would really benefit from it if it can be deployed in a simple way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's one retailer, I won't mention it because one of our colleagues works there, who has a performance management system, and they rate everybody every 2 years. And if you're in the bottom, I think it's 10% of ratings, 2 sessions running, you're on the road to dismissal. Now, there isn't a philosophy of why is that person beginning to underperform where ones that did perform. And, you know, it might be more efficient to try and restore them. It's a machine, you know, being put through a mincer.
It's a GE model, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
I think the real challenge with the mental toughness approach, when you talk to contact centers and high turnover sales teams, I worked with a sales team or in a business with a sales team where we had 50 salespeople and we recruited 50 salespeople every year. But we had 25 salespeople who were long-standing members of staff. So we recruited every 6 months, and the actual challenge and the problem was motivation. It's because the people that were coming in were motivated to do one thing. The organization was motivated to do something completely different. So HR were motivated to put people in roles, irrespective of whether they stayed. And the people who were coming in, all they really wanted was a job so they could stepping stone into somewhere else. And essentially they sat there blissfully lying to each other. And I've done it for years and will continue to do it because it's the only way that they see to approach it, rather than taking a systematic approach. The challenge is that what they'll find is that if they take this sort of approach and a motivation approach and start to look at the mental toughness of people, and there are some really mentally tough people in the business, they become harder to find. It makes the recruitment process much more difficult. And puts more pressure on the recruiters, as opposed to, well, we'll just keep throwing people at the problem and some of them will stick. And actually the only way they've been successful is actually they've reduced the size of the sales team. So there's only 30 now, not 50. So they don't have to recruit for as many roles. It's a real challenge, but I think it's a massive opportunity to be able to get the right people into the right place with the right thinking.
Some years ago, Lee, we did some work for Ford when we worked at what they call Ford University. It was at Loughborough at that time. And if you're a Ford dealer, you're required to attend training courses twice a year. And they began to introduce what they call soft skills training. So they asked Peter and I to do this. And we would do this in this auditorium with about 150 dealers. I normally get a polite or a response like this when I'm talking to people. Twice in my life I've been quite brutally heckled, and this was one of them. So Peter and I, we were verbally abused because Peter stood up and he talked about motivation, and we're pretty much a similar discussion to what we've got now, and the importance of mental toughness. And then one by one, people began to say, what a load of bollocks. All that salesmen are interested in is money. It's money. Forget all of this bollocks. And bit by bit, there was this kind of momentum grew, and people were heckling us.
It's funny, company, the way that they motivate staff is through money.
Yeah.
And if you can be 20 years old, and as long as you serve your probation, you can be earning £100,000 a year driving a high-end Mercedes. And we had people who were in their early 20s earning that amount of money. I mean, they all burnt out. They all failed, generally from a mental perspective, not a physical perspective. But it was all about money. It was all money oriented, and there was a promise, and the promise was never really fulfilled. Only 3 people could be the top salespeople. Only 3 people could go on the private yacht and all of that sort of things.
You're talking about one end of the employment spectrum. But more recently, a lot of our work has been with high-end professional firms, and the reality is you see exactly the same there. It's all about money.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, I've had a recent conversation. I don't think anybody from that organisation is listening, so I'm not going to name the organisation. But they spoke about they solve their problems with money, but they find that the best leave anyway, and they're left with the poorer performers. But the poorer performers are trapped because of the money. And so money as a motivator can be very counterproductive.
And you go back to that sense of, so the opposite of intrinsic motivation, like when people talk, I call intrinsic motivation autonomous motivation. The opposite of autonomous motivation is controlled motivation. So when I'm teaching a dog to sit or lay down, it's based on an external reward for doing so. Like you get a biscuit when you do it, and I'll withhold that reward if you don't do it. Now, dogs, as much as I love my dog, he's got a pretty smooth brain on him. Like, there's not an awful lot going on there. The human brain is way more complicated than that. And it's crazy that we think you'd still motivate that through the presence of providing or withholding a reward, which in any kind of, there'd be very few people who feel motivated when they feel I'm actually just being controlled. You know, you have the reward that I require to meet the minimum standard of living, and the threat is I either get it or you withhold it or you give me more. It's such a basic way, you know. So I'd urge people to just try and get a bit deeper when you think about what actually motivates people. I must apologise, I have a meeting just started now, so I'll have to run off.
Cheers, John. Thank you for that.
But great to chat, and wish everyone all the best.
Yes, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Right, so just have a quick look at the chats. Yeah, Sue, Tony will get in touch about the ramp measure, and Karen, Tony will get in touch with you too. I'm just going to go and finish with one little slide. Oh, come on. And one of the things, see, if you look at the sort of things that we've been talking about over the past few sessions, and it's actually live because the World Economic Forum meeting starts today. They identified in 2023 the top 10 skills priorities for 2027. They do this regularly all the way up to 2050. And it's basically at this stage, it's the same list. If you look at these top 10 skills, they have creative thinking, analytical thinking, they have leadership and social influence, resilience, flexibility, and agility, and that's mental toughness. Obviously, we talk about resilience and positivity, curiosity and lifelong learning, and then you've got motivation and self-awareness, and empathy and active listening. Mental toughness ticks 6 of those boxes. So, when we're talking about the future, mental toughness is going to be increasingly an important concept. to be able to achieve the development of these skills. And I know John's gone, and I'm just going to throw a teaser out, because one of the things, as you know, John has been looking at the profiles that are created through the use of the mental toughness questionnaire. And we tend, as users, to look at individual pieces of information. We look at, say, goal orientation. What does this mean? And because it's incredibly complicated to do, sometimes we'll say, oh, look at the way goal orientation and interpersonal confidence sit together. Look, they've got high score on one, low score on the other. This might mean this. Well, John has been looking at clusters. So he's been looking for patterns to see if there are patterns within the data when people complete the questionnaire that make significant predictions. And we got 1,300 people to complete a questionnaire on innovation and creativity. So that's one of the items. Creative thinking is number 2 on the World Economic Forum list, and got them, well, they were completing the mental toughness questionnaire for another reason. 30% of the variance in creativity was predicted by mental toughness. But look, the interesting thing here was that 4 of the factors correlated very closely, as you'd expect: goal orientation, learning orientation, risk orientation, interpersonal confidence, the ability to engage with other people and ask loads of questions. But curiously, achievement orientation was negatively correlated with innovation and creativity. And achievement orientation is something that we value. We like employees to have high levels of achievement orientation. Now, this doesn't mean that people with high levels of achievement orientation have no chance of being creative. But what this is telling us is there's something here that we need to understand. If we want to optimize creativity, and we find we've got a very performance-orientated culture, there is some evidence here that we won't get that creativity. But if we understand what we've got and understand how we might manage that, then we will get at that creativity. And a simple explanation, we think, because this obviously requires a great deal more attention and a great deal more work, that if you're very achievement orientated, you are extremely focused. That's part of the definition. You avoid distractions. You go for the goal, and you put all your effort into achieving the goal. The consequences of that is you begin to miss, and you're not paying attention to all the other things that might provoke or stimulate creativity. So that's just something to leave you with, because this is the kind of stuff that we want to get over to practitioners and to users, and to continue to do this, I mean, for years to come, because this kind of stuff is coming down the line all the time. So not necessarily now, but by means, email your suggestions in. If you can think of how we might be able to get what we know and what we're beginning to learn to a wider audience and engage with that wider audience, we'd really appreciate hearing from you. And we do know we're not the only people who are struggling, because the people who developed Hogan, which is one of the best behavioral measures there is, they're also experiencing exactly the same problem. Once somebody's done a Hogan course, they don't pay any more attention. They don't do any more learning. They just go and use what they learned on a 3 or 4 day program. We want to try and get beyond that, because there's something actually quite useful, something extremely valuable here. So with that, I just want to thank you all for listening, for your questions, for your engaging in this conversation. We love these conversations. And thank you to John, who is becoming a giant in this field. And we're delighted that he got his appointment on the 8th of January to professor. So it's a second person that's made full professor because of the work in mental toughness. It shows that there's a degree of recognition, at least in the academic world. So thank you all.